And it's a real pleasure to be here in this beautiful setting. I've never been here before, and it's actually worth the drive out here, which you can't take that for granted. Right? Well, I'll just jump right in. I'd like to start with some words of St. John Paul II from his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, which was published in 1993. First, he said, certain currents of modern thought have gone so far as to exalt freedom to such an extent that it becomes an absolute, which would then be the source of values. This is the direction taken by doctrines which have lost the sense of the transcendent or which are explicitly atheist. And I'm sure we're all aware of currents of thought or doctrines like that. But then he went on, which is interesting. He said, side by side with its exaltation of freedom, yet oddly in contrast with it, modern culture radically questions the very existence of this freedom. A number of disciplines grouped under the name of the behavioral sciences have rightly drawn attention to the many kinds of psychological and social conditioning which influence the exercise of human freedom. Knowledge of these conditionings and the study that they have received represent important achievements which have found application in various areas, for example, in pedagogy or the administration of justice. But, he concluded, some people, going beyond the conclusions which can be legitimately drawn from these observations, have come to question or even deny the very reality of human freedom. And I think this is at least as true today as it was in 1993, maybe more so. Let me just cite one example, a fairly prominent example. Just last December, a very famous Stanford neuroscientist named Robert Sapolsky, there he is, he was featured in a University of Chicago podcast. The podcast, by the way, has the rather absurd name of Big Brains. That's the name of the podcast. Anyway, that's kind of embarrassing, actually. But anyway, Dr. Sapolsky claims to prove that free will is indeed an illusion. In fact, he's got a whole book and a number of highly viewed YouTube videos on that topic. And he is not at all an isolated voice. There are quite a few prominent authors and speakers who put forward arguments fairly similar to his. Now, of course, our faith requires us to believe in free will. If we were not free, then, as Sapolsky knows very well, we would not be responsible for our actions. There would be no such thing as sin, nor any such thing as the forgiveness of sins. And personally, I think that our having free will is also kind of a matter of common sense. In fact, I think Sapolsky would agree with that. At least in practice, we all act as if we had it, as if we had free will. And he's the first to admit that. Every time we stop and deliberate about what we're going to do, whether we're going to do this or that, or something else, we're actually exercising our free will. Or at least we think we are. Even Dr. Sapolsky and the others who deny it admit that they usually act as if they had it. But they think that they have good, solid arguments, even proofs in his case, to show that it's only an illusion that we're laboring under. And they also think that we will be better off if, as far as we can, if we refuse to believe in free will. They think that's actually better. And that's precisely because then we will not hold people responsible for their actions. If there's no free will, then no one is to blame for what they do. They can't help it. And they say, this is kind of comforting. Okay? And not only because, I can't be blamed then for what I do, but less egoistically, I can't blame others either, because they can't help it. And if I can't blame them, then I can't get angry with them, or I can't be disappointed at them, or be offended by them. I can be more at peace with people. This is his argument. I can be at peace. Belief in free will leads to conflict. He also has some remarks, which I won't go into, about how this should lead to a radical change in our, as you can imagine, in our penal justice system, right? Because there's really no such thing as punishment anymore. Okay? So that would have to undergo a complete overhaul. I won't go into that. I think there's probably some truth in the idea that belief in free will leads to conflict. It leads to blaming people and ascribing responsibility of various sorts. But I'll just say two things about that before I really get into my topic. The first one is, if it's true that without free will there's no blame, well, it's also true that there's no praise. To deny free will is to deny responsibility not only for bad things, but also for good things. If I can't be angry with anybody, I can't be grateful to them either. If they treat me well, it's not because they choose to do so, but because they can't help it. And if old Aristotle is right, to deny free will is really ultimately to deny the very possibility of friendship between people. He thinks friendship, it's essential to friendship that you have freely chosen to be that person's friend. Okay? And the other thing that I always found curious, I think it's curious that Dr. Sapolsky and the others spend so much time trying to persuade us that it's better to believe that free will does not exist than to believe that it does. They're speaking as though we had some choice about what we believe. Now, I think we do. But it's not really consistent with the very thing that they want us to believe. So even in the course of arguing against free will, they seem to be kind of taking it for granted. Well, the big purpose of my talk is then to kind of defend the existence of free will and to provide some ideas in defense of it. However, I should say at the start, I'm only going to do so in a kind of indirect way. It seems to me that many of the arguments that are brought up against free will are actually based on simply a misconception, a misunderstanding of what it's supposed to be. Later, I'll explain what I think the mistake is in Dr. Sapolsky's concept. But I think that if people had a correct concept of it, they would be far less likely to deny that it exists. So really what I want to do is just one thing tonight. I just want to sketch with a certain amount of precision what I think is the correct concept of the freedom of the will. And I hope that you'll find that the sketch kind of rings true, that this does answer to the idea. As it happens in that podcast, Dr. Sapolsky said that anyone who still believes in free will is living in the 15th century. Well, I'm going to be going back to the 13th century, actually, to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's just, as it happens, this year marks the 750th anniversary of his death. And next year will be the 800th anniversary of his birth. He died at 49, which is really quite astonishing if you think of of all that he did. So my remarks are in two parts. First, I want to go over a number of things, 5 things, in fact, that the freedom of the will is not, and that people often think that it's supposed to be. Just kind of clear the terrain, get rid of some mistaken ideas. And then I'll try to convey what I think is the positive core of the concept of free will. And then at the end, if there's still time, I'll mention one very important thing that I think the existence of free will depends on. So here are some things that free will, at least as St. Thomas conceives it, and I'm pretty convinced by his conception, some things that don't fit his concept. First, very important, Thomas doesn't think, I wanted to get rid of that and put, yeah, that's better, that's better. Yeah, that's a little better. Thomas doesn't think that our wills or that we are free about everything. What do I mean by the will? I should say that right off from the start. By the will, I just mean the capacity that we have and that nothing else on earth has to want things that we think are good. We have a concept of the good, and we can want things because we think they're good, right? And also the capacity to shun things or avoid things that we think are bad. It's that simple. But there's at least one thing for Thomas that we have to want, that we can't help it. We necessarily want it. We're naturally determined to want it. And that's what he calls happiness. I've got a picture of happiness. On the left is happiness. What is it to be happy? Well, it's to have the total good. Fully to be happy is to have the total good, to have what literally leaves nothing to be desired. And we all want that. We have different ideas about what that might consist in, but we all want that, and we can't help it. And there's also something that we simply cannot want, something we necessarily shun or avoid, and that's the absolute contrary of happiness, which Thomas calls misery. So that's the other side. Misery. Nobody wants to be miserable. Sometimes it might look like they do, but they don't. Now that might seem to constitute some kind of limit or constraint on the freedom of our will. Wouldn't we be even freer if we weren't determined to anything, if we could want misery or avoid happiness? Well, not for Thomas. He thinks that the desire for happiness is really the mover, the motor, if you like, of our free will. It's kind of what I would call the master desire. It's the desire of desires, and it's what gives us mastery over all of our other desires. The desire for that total good is what enables us to actively determine ourselves, to decide for ourselves about all limited goods or partial goods. And that's the domain of free will, those partial goods. And it's a big domain. But without that determination to the total good, we wouldn't be free because we would just be kind of bounced around from one desire to another. We would be kind of passive. We'd be slaves, driven just by one urge after another. We wouldn't have any control over our desires. We'd be like the other animals who are driven just by their instincts. Now, in the second part of the talk, I'll go more into how that works, this process which I would call, and Thomas calls, self-determination of our wills. But that's the first thing. We're not free about everything. Happiness, we're not free about that. Another thing that free will is not, and it's often thought to be by those who attack it, is a power to act at random or for no reason. Now, it's true, we do many things, I suppose, for no reason. We do things on a whim. We flip a coin If we can't decide, we just flip a coin. Okay? And those things, I would say, in a sense, we do them freely, in the sense that we're not determined to do them, we're not made to do them, we're not forced to do them. But we don't really determine ourselves to do them either. We just sort of let ourselves do them. We just sort of let ourselves go. Maybe we could determine ourselves, but we don't. We're just kind of passive. Whereas free will isn't mainly about that. Free will is more active. It's about being in command, being in control of your actions. Okay? What does that activity consist in? Well, it consists first and foremost in the act that Thomas calls electio, choice. That's where we get election. We've got an election coming up. Well, not too close. But we exercise freedom in making choices. He thinks that's the core of it, is the fact that we can make choices. What's a choice? I like to give this. Thomas is really good at making definitions. He's really good at that. And he gives a really simple definition of choice. Okay? He says to choose is to take one thing while refusing another. It's very simple. Right? I think he's got it. I think he nails it with that. I'll look at that more closely later. But what I want to stress right now is that when we make a choice, a genuine choice, and we're not just acting at random, our choice always has a reason. We always have a reason for our choice. Right? We take one thing instead of another, or refusing another, because it seems better somehow. Right? And that's our reason for choosing it. If the other had seemed better, we could choose the other if it seemed better. But we always have a reason. We have a reason, we accept that reason, and we apply it to our will, and that's making the choice. This is really important because today, a lot of times the question of free will is treated as if it were about a power of doing things for no reason, just acting for no reason, just at random, right? And so if they can show, which they have tried to, that the things that we do for no reason can be explained without talk of free will, without any appeal to free will, then they think that they've eliminated any reason to believe in free will. One of the arguments that Dr. Sapolsky invokes is along those lines. Maybe some of you have heard of it. He cites a psychological experiment that was conducted in the 1980s, actually an old experiment by a scientist named Benjamin Libet. I don't know if you've heard of this. The Libet experiment. It became pretty famous. It became famous because it seemed to present kind of hard scientific evidence that the things that we think we do freely are really determined in advance by unconscious processes in our brains. That was what he claimed to prove with his experiment. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the experiment because, as a matter of fact, in recent years, other scientists have come to realize that it was not a very good experiment, scientifically speaking. It's been kind of debunked, right? It was taking for granted the very thing that it claimed to prove, namely that those processes in the brain were the causes of the things that the people thought they were doing freely. Right? It just took that for granted. Right? So it wasn't a very good argument. But whether or not it was a good experiment, to me, that's not even that interesting. To me, it wasn't even about free choice in the first place. Because what was it focusing on? He was having people sit in a chair and decide to, say, lift a finger at some moment or not, right? Or to turn their head, or to engage in other kind of meaningless bodily movements, or press a button or not press a button. And he claimed that really something in the brain was firing ahead of their awareness of deciding to do that, and that was causing them to do it, right? Well, that's not the realm of free choice. We do all sorts of things at random, like I'm moving my hand now. I didn't sit and deliberate about whether to move my hand, right? Those things are too trivial, right? Free choice is not about trivial stuff. We don't deliberate about things that are trivial because we don't think it matters, right? We deliberate about things that we think matter, right? So that's another really important point, I think. Free choice is not about things we do for no reason. Another one kind of connected with that, a little more technical, is that acts of free choice are not uncaused acts. Sometimes that's what people describe them as, what they're supposed to be. Acts that have no cause, they just happen. Well, that's not true either. Acts have reasons, our free choices have reasons, and they have causes. They have all sorts of causes, right? Here I have to get a little metaphysical. I'm doing St. Thomas. I can't help it. I'm sorry. Right? I don't have any free choice about that. What's a cause? What's a cause? He says, a cause is that upon which something else depends. That's a cause of the thing. A depends on B, well, B is a cause of A. Right? So the existence of a choice depends on many things. It depends on the chooser. If the chooser isn't there, then there's no choice, obviously. It depends on the chooser's desire for happiness. All of our choices are somehow aimed in some way toward happiness. Maybe not very well, not aimed very well, but they're for that. There's also many other factors influencing the reasons that we have for our choices, and those are causes. I don't know, if you stop working to go get a cup of coffee. Okay? Well, at that moment, you think that you need coffee, that it's better to get coffee than to continue working for whatever reason. Right? You've got a reason for thinking that. Right? And you choose this place to get a cup of coffee. They've got better coffee, or somebody recommended it, or somebody told you that it's less expensive, or a friend of yours works there. You've got all sorts of influences on your choices, obviously. Right? They have causes. And that doesn't mean they're not free. Right? What would mean that they're not free is to say that they are determined by their causes. Right? And some people think that causes always do that. They determine. That is, they make it impossible for the thing not to happen. Right? That's what it means to be determined. It makes it necessary, that you can't help it. Right? Well, you choose to get a cup of coffee because you're sleepy. Does that mean that you couldn't help it? Right? That you had to get the cup of coffee? Well, no. Maybe you could just go take a nap. Obviously. Right? Maybe you choose not to get that cup of coffee precisely because you're sleepy and you want to stop depending so much on coffee to help you out of your sleepiness. You might do that. Or another, you choose not to eat because you're hungry. It's Lent and you're hungry and you're not going to eat because you want to offer that up as a little mortification. People do that, right? Obviously. Okay. So the causes of our actions don't determine us. That's the question, whether they determine us to do what we do. If they determine us, then yes, we don't have a choice. Because a choice is that. Right? A choice, if it exists, is kind of a new determination that we make. We determine ourselves to do what we weren't yet determined to do. We make that determination. That's what a choice is. Right? If it exists. But this is where I think we see the mistake in Dr. Sapolsky's concept of free will. His whole argument, is based on the fact, and he says this, it's based on the fact that people are found experimentally to act differently when the influences on their brains change. They act differently when their brains are under different influences. Well, no kidding. Right? Really? he thinks that that proves that our actions are determined. Okay? Because what does he say? He says that what he means by free will is the ability to act without influences. Well, nobody does that. Nobody does that. It's a straw man. It's absolutely a straw man. Nobody thinks that freedom of choice, nobody who believes in it and who thinks about it, thinks that it means you're acting without influences. Okay? He doesn't distinguish. I'm sure he's a brilliant neuroscientist. I have no doubt about that. Right? He's brilliant. But he's not a philosopher. Right? And he doesn't make the distinction between influencing and determining. Of course we act under influences. But he just assumes, well, then the influences must determine us. And that doesn't follow. Right? You know, really, this kind of argument, the materialists have been putting forth this sort of argument, like Dr. Sapolsky's, for about 2,500 years. Plato answers this kind of argument pretty well, you know, a long time ago, but they haven't read Plato. You know, so it's not that the distinction, I don't think it's that hard to understand, is it? Is it the distinction between being influenced and being compelled, right? Or being necessitated or determined? Right? But there are a lot of really big brains that don't seem to get the distinction. You know, it's kind of disappointing. A fourth thing, if the freedom of our choices is not incompatible, I did want to put up that's the influences on the brain. Sorry. If the freedom of our choices is not incompatible with their having causes, neither is it incompatible with a good deal of predictability in our behavior. Such predictability is the result of two things. Right? One is that many of the influences on us are themselves fairly predictable. We live in a fairly predictable world. We know what kind of influences people are under. Right? The physical makeup of the world, our own physical makeup, the human world, our psychic makeup, they've got a good deal of stability, and we know a lot about it. Right? And this, insurance people who develop market strategies, they're predicting human behavior all the time, and they can be pretty good at it. Right? They can be pretty successful. And that's not a problem for free will. You know, St. Thomas even thought that astrology could be successful. He was pretty convinced that astrology could be successful in predicting the natural temperaments of people born at different times of the year. He was okay with that idea. He thought that, yeah, the stars influence a lot. You're born under one sign or another. He was okay. He didn't know a lot about astronomy. We know that. Okay. But today, you know, we might not say that, but we would say that a person's temperament is a matter of their genetic endowment, or a matter of the climate, or their early upbringing, or whatever, right? And Thomas thought, and I think it's true, it's kind of obvious, that people tend to act according to their temperament, right? They tend to, anyway. So if somebody is a kind of irascible person, you know, they tend to get angry really fast and fly off the handle. Well, those kind of people often do things to satisfy their anger. Well, no kidding, right? And you can sort of predict. If you know somebody well enough, you can kind of predict. This is going to trigger them. This is going to set them off, right? And you know that. And Thomas is okay with that, right? But he insists that our temperaments don't determine our choices. So the heavenly bodies or our genetic makeup or whatever can influence our temperament, but we can stop and reflect on our temperament too. And we can decide, a person might actually say, hey, you know, they've told me I get angry a lot. Maybe I should work on that. And people have done that. You know, St. Francis de Sales, he was famous for that. He was kind of an irascible person as a young man. Okay? But by the time he died, he was famous for being just the meekest person on earth. He was just gentle and calm. He would never get upset about anything. He worked on it for years. He worked on his character, and he changed it. Okay? Because he could reflect on it. He had reason, and he could reflect on that. and he decided he didn't want to be like that. And Thomas himself, he quotes the famous astronomer, the ancient astronomer Ptolemy, who knew something about the stars. Right? Because Ptolemy says, the wise man, the man who uses his mind to govern his actions, the wise man dominates the stars, Ptolemy said. So it's a beautiful expression. Thomas draws on the astronomer to say it. So he doesn't think that astrology can determine our actions. So now, talking about temperament, that leads us to talking about character, right, and virtues and vices and so forth. And that brings us back to the idea of responsibility. Right? A virtue helps us to perform good actions. A vice is a tendency to perform bad actions. And that leads to the whole idea of moral responsibility. And certainly our power of free choice brings with it the drama of good and evil, moral good and evil. But this brings up one last thing that I wanted to mention, that free choice is not, or is not primarily anyway, it's in our free choice, but it's not the main thing. And that is just the plain choice between good and evil, right? Or between right and wrong. That's not absolutely essential for free choice. I think this is really interesting, because that's where we tend to go. We think of good and evil anyway, when we think of free choice. Okay. Thomas thinks actually it's a weakness of our freedom. It's an imperfection of our freedom that we can choose badly, that we can make bad choices. Because basically, he boils it down to the possibility of not using the light of our own minds as fully as we could to think through what we're doing. Okay? That makes the situation complicated. Right? But I'll come back to this idea of how we can choose evil a little bit later. But what I want to say is that we shouldn't start there. This is complicated. To explain how we can do bad things voluntarily or by choice, that's complicated. We should take it up later. We should start with just with good things, choices between good things, okay? Which isn't always trivial, that kind of choice. It's not just the choice of, spaghetti alle vongole or fettuccine, some kind of what you choose on the menu. Right? It might be the choice of a career or a home or a spouse. Right? Those are serious choices. It's not a choice between good and evil, but it's a serious choice nonetheless. Okay? So there's these 5 things. Right? That free will is not a power to choose absolutely anything. We can't choose misery. It's not a power to act at random or for no reason. It's not a power to act without any causes or influences. It's not incompatible with acting in a predictable way. And it's not primarily a power to choose between good and evil. Okay? Well, then what is it? That's the second part. Earlier I mentioned that very simple description that Thomas gives of what it is to choose. To take one thing, to refuse another. It's kind of a two-pronged act, a choice. It bears on what you choose, what you take, and what you refuse. It's a decision. A decision from Latin, it means like a cutting off. You cut off one part and you take the other. Right? And that's how you determine yourself. A choice is a determination in that sense. It takes this rather than that, and that's what Thomas calls it. The will determines itself. How can we do that? Well, there are 2 basic factors. One is the fact that we can make comparisons between things. We can put up alternatives and look at how they relate to each other. Okay? We can do that because we have reason. Right? The other animals can't do that. Okay? And then in practical things, this is called deliberation. We can deliberate. We have a goal in mind, and we need to decide what to do in order to reach the goal. We can go this way or that way. We survey the field. We see that there are some alternatives. We study them. We weigh up the pros and the cons, and we finally choose one. And we choose one, why? For what seems better about it. Right? Right? This should be obvious. Right? I shouldn't be telling you anything that's not obvious. And that's our reason. We always choose for a reason. There's also another factor which is really important. Not all comparisons would leave us free to choose, you know. If we're going to compare, if you just compare abstractly the numbers 3 and 6, and you ask, well, which one is bigger? Well, you don't really have much choice about that, right? That's determined. Right? There's only one possibility. But when we deliberate about our actions, we're not comparing them only as to which one is bigger, which alternative is bigger. That might be one factor. You might want a bigger car, for example. Right? But we're asking which one is better. When we make a choice, when we deliberate, we want to know which one is better. We're comparing things as to their goodness. Right? This brings us back to the idea of the good. Right? We're looking at things from the point of view of that master desire, that desire for the total good. We want to get closer to the total good. We want what's better. Right? And goodness, for Thomas, is something really huge. Goodness, the idea of the good is enormous. Right? It's a lot bigger than size, if I can put it that way. Okay? Goodness belongs to many, many, many different features of things. Right? A good deed, good food, good music, you make a good guess, okay? A good whatever. Good is all over the place, and it's just really different. The goodness of one thing is just totally different. You know, the difference between a good horse and a good lecture, right? What do they even have in common? You might wonder, you know, does the word mean do they have anything in common at all? It's enormous. It's just huge. Right? Negative features can be good too. You know, heat is good, but sometimes it's good to turn off the heat. Right? Too much of a good thing is not good. So it comes in many forms. Thomas says, bonum est multiplex. The good is multiple. It's manifold. Many forms. Right? That's important. Why? Because it means that something can be better in one way and worse in another way. The same thing. Right? In fact, it always will be. It always will be. Right? Whenever we make a choice. The only thing that's better in every way is happiness. Right? And we have no choice about that. We want that. Right? But about other things, we have a choice. Let's take a really simple example. This is the example I generally use. Suppose I need a car. Right? I could use a car. Right? There's one here. It's really glamorous. It's beautiful. It's fast. Right? It's amazing. Right? It's powerful. It's also pretty expensive. Right? Then there's another one. I'm sorry if anybody has a car just like that, but there's another one there. It's economical. It's a bit clunky. Right? So I couldn't really, but let's say I could afford the glamorous one. Yeah, no, I couldn't afford that. But suppose I could afford it, but it would cost, right? And I could put up with my friends making fun of me for the other one, right? But not so easily either, because I'm kind of touchy, right? So either one is kind of, well, yes and no, you know. Now, I might find the choice so hard that I have to keep looking. Maybe I can find another car. I keep studying it, right? But that might leave me in the same position. No absolute winner. You can't offer me any that's just perfect, best from every point of view. Do I really have to go on deliberating? No. I can just stop and say, look, I got to make a choice. I'm just going to choose. I'll take this one. Right? The one I take it for what's better about it. Right? But I do so in the face of the other one, knowing what's better about the other one, and knowing that I could have taken that one instead. Right? We do this all the time, it seems to me. This is how choice works. The alternatives, just looking at studying the alternatives doesn't absolutely decide the question. It puts me in a position to make a decision because it gives me sufficient reasons to choose one or the other. But it's still I who have to make the choice. I just make the choice at some point. I say, okay, I'm going to go this way. And that's a brand new determination. Nothing makes me do that. Okay? I'm the one who makes that choice. And it's a new direction that I start moving in. Now you might say, well, if I have this before me, a glamorous car, but expensive, an economical car, but clunky, well, then it boils down to a choice between glamour, right, and economy, or something like that. Don't I have to choose between those two qualities, those two values, glamour and economy? Well, maybe, and maybe I'd have to deliberate about that, but there doesn't have to be a clear winner there either. They're both goods, right? And each of them is sufficient to take it rather than the other, seems to me. Right? Nothing forces me to take one or the other. I don't have to undertake a separate deliberation, and I don't need another reason to come and decide. Right? They're good enough. It's I who choose. There doesn't have to be an absolute winner. There usually is not. When I choose, I always have a reason. But it doesn't have to be a necessitating reason, a determining reason. It just has to be enough to make the thing seem better to me in some way. That's all I need. Right? And this is really common. People reason, this is Thomas's point, people reason and deliberate about things that have no knockdown arguments all the time, right? They do that individually, they do that in groups, right? Most political discussions are like that, right? There's not going to be, it's not a scientific proof. Right? They're not going to give you that we have to do this, that we have to go to war, or that we have to not go to war, or that we have to, I don't know, charge this tax or whatever. There's reasons on both sides. And often they're good reasons on both sides. And ultimately, they just have to take a vote, right, and make a choice. Right? That's all. Thomas calls those kinds of reasonings, he says those have a name, right? And that the kind of reasonings involved in such choices, they're called rhetorical reasonings, rhetorical arguments. That's the domain of rhetoric, and it's reasoning, right? Sometimes we even argue and reason about things that we only have opinions about. We're not going to do anything with it, but we debate our opinions on various topics, and we don't have proof, right? Thomas calls that dialectic, and the philosophers study that, too. It's a whole field of study. Okay, but now let me come back to something I talked about before, which is very important for us. Go back to the idea that we desire happiness necessarily. We can't help it. Now, there's some things that a person thinks are necessary for happiness. Okay? For example, Christians, insofar as they're Christians, think that avoiding sin is necessary for their happiness, ultimately, right? We all understand that. Okay? As Christians, they can't think that it's better to sin than not to sin. And yet, it's quite possible for a Christian to choose to sin. Or at least that's what they taught us in the seminary. That's what right? That's what they've taught, that Christians can sin, right? We spend a lot of time in the box there for that reason, right? So, but the point is, it looks as though then we do choose things for no reason, things that we think are worse, and we still choose them. Okay? So, does it come back to being totally arbitrary? Does choice come back to be totally arbitrary? Well, no. This is the choice between good and evil, right and wrong, and this is complicated. This is complicated. Let me try to just lay out Thomas's explanation briefly. I think this is important. Thomas doesn't think that the possibility of choosing to sin is an exception to the rule that we always choose for a reason, or that what we choose always has a feature that makes it seem better to us. Right? What is distinctive about the choice to sin is that a reason is not a good one. The sin seems better at the moment when we choose it, but only from kind of a partial point of view, from a limited point of view. For example, we might have a strong feeling that makes it look good to do that, right, at that moment, right? When the Christian steps back and thinks of his life as a whole and where he's going, he sees that it's not really an alternative. It's not really a choice, okay? But he's not always looking at it from that point of view. We're right in the middle of things sometimes. We can't always be standing back and thinking of our lives as a whole. We're right in the middle of stuff, right? And when we're in a situation that calls for a choice, it can be up to us to stop and think about it or not, right? Up to us to apply those deep beliefs that we have about what is choice-worthy. And that can take effort, right? And that's not easy. And before we make that effort, something that in fact is sinful can present kind of an attractive face to us. Right? That's what happened to Eve. Something that she shouldn't do. It looked good. And the scripture says it looked good to eat, and it looked good for the knowledge that he gave. And so it seemed better. And that's enough. Did she have to choose it? No. But she had a reason at that moment to choose it, and a reason for choosing it rather than stepping back and saying, wait a minute, I should talk to Adam or I should talk to God about this before I decide. Right? You know, sometimes people actually do that. People actually do resist temptation sometimes. It has happened, right? The people say no. The thing looks attractive, but they say, wait a minute, let's think about this. Right? And they actually say no. So this is really important. The choice between good and evil is not at all a refutation or an exception to the account of free choice that we've given. There's another question that might arise, though. I think this is really interesting. Can there be free choice without the possibility of sinning? Is there free choice in heaven? I think, on Thomas's view, heaven is where free choice really comes into its own. What we have here is only a shadow of it. Let me give you an analogy. This is what I wanted. Think of this heavenly musician, so to speak, Mozart. Right? Okay, think of him and think of some sort of amateur hack like myself. Okay, we both sit down at the piano. Now, whatever Mozart plays, he can't make a mistake. It would just kill him. He just can't make a musical mistake. He can't commit a musical sin. He just won't do it. Whatever he does, it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be perfect. It's going to be really good, right? Me, I do it all the time. I make all kinds of mistakes, right? Now, which one of us is freer at the piano? Right? Which one of us has more possibilities? Right? Which one of us is more creative? Well, that's obvious. The variety of Mozart's play, of his composition, is just astounding, right? He comes up with something new, something wonderful every time, and you analyze it, it's perfect. With me, it's the same three riffs, and badly executed, right? You know, for the most part, sin is kind of boring. It actually is kind of boring. I don't know about you, Father, but when I tell people, half joking, but only half, is that the hardest thing for the priest in the confessional is to stay awake. There's a lot of beautiful things that happen in the confessional, too. There's a lot of virtue that is exercised in the confessional. So, but the sins themselves, it's generally the same old stuff, right? And it's kind of boring. Right? Virtue is not boring, right? And in heaven, you know, where people can't sin because they see the face of God, and God then is absolutely irresistible, literally irresistible. He's like happiness itself, right? Well, one not only sees that, one sees the very essence of goodness and sees then all the innumerable, infinite ways of imitating that goodness, and they're all good, right? So you're standing before a myriad of choices that you never had thought of before. I think that's what heaven is going to be like. Right? So, just to sum up, a choice is an act of taking one thing and refusing another. Its freedom depends on two things. The fact that the good is multiform. There are many forms of goodness, right? Many ways of being better, right? And the power that we have to make comparisons between things. It's pretty simple. The freedom of making good or bad choices, that adds a third factor, which is kind of a weakness, which is the fact that we can't always have in mind what we most deeply want and most deeply value, And sometimes then we act against that. Without that, we would still have free choice, you know. And then maybe even Dr. Sapolsky wouldn't mind it. You know, I don't think he would mind the free choice in heaven, would he? It wouldn't be a source of conflict. Right? He's mainly talking about the freedom to make bad choices. But if we do have that, then I think it's better to admit it and to learn to deal with it. Well, I have one other thought. Do I have time for one other thought? Okay, thank you. I just want to call attention, I think it's important to do this, to one other thing that the freedom of our will depends upon. The freedom of our will depends upon, and that's God. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a priest and I should always bring it. I mean, that's also true. But of course, in some sense, everything that we do and everything that we are depends upon God because he created us, right? But freedom of choice depends on God in a very special way, in a very intimate way, precisely because it depends on this desire that we have for the total good, this desire for happiness, right? Thomas calls that the universal good. We have the desire for universal good, right? Which is huge. Our desire is something really enormous in us, right? The desire that we have inside of ourselves, right? The question then is, what kind of a cause can produce a desire like that? We came into being, right, with this desire. How could such a desire even exist? Well, Thomas thinks it needs a kind of infinite cause. Okay? Only an infinite cause, only what he calls a universal mover can produce a desire like that. Only God can do that. So in some way, all of our free choices depend on God's influence, giving us, in our nature, giving us that infinite desire for happiness, right? Which is the basis for our free choice. Now, this doesn't mean that he makes our choices for us, or he determines our choices. Thomas denies that. Absolutely. Let me quote Thomas. He says, God, as the universal mover, moves man's will to the universal object of the will, which is the good, the whole good. So God moves us in that direction, toward the good. And without that universal motion, he calls it, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? A universal motion. Right? Man cannot will anything. But man determines himself by his reason, by his mind, by his thinking, to will this or that, just to make a choice, this or that which is either a true good or a merely apparent good. That's Thomas's language. Right? It's always something that seems somehow good. It might really be good. It might be only an apparent good. The apparent good is the bad choice. We don't choose it because it's bad, because it seems somehow good. God does not move us toward that. He doesn't make us sin. Okay? That would be terrible. Some people have held that. I won't go into that. We can talk about that if you want. But our sins depend upon God in a kind of indirect way, because even when we're sinning, we're seeking happiness. And he gave us that desire for happiness. But when we sin, we're going against the drift of that very desire, right? And going against the drift of his influence, right? Putting up an obstacle to it. Of course, our good acts are in line with God's influence, right? And sometimes he even gives us a kind of special help to perform good acts. He gives us grace, for example, which helps us a lot to do good things. But even that doesn't determine us. Right? Thomas insists on that. He says grace exists in us in such a way that it leaves us free to follow it or not. It's up to us to accept that grace and to use it and follow it or not. Right? It doesn't determine us. Right? As St. Augustine says, God created us without us, but he will not justify us without our own free choice to follow him. Right? And it really is free. It really is up to us. Right? And so maybe in that sense, I think we can kind of sympathize a little with people who deny free will, because free will is kind of scary. in the end, it's a little bit scary. Sometimes maybe we don't want to be free, right? It is scary. But nevertheless, I think Thomas would say, yeah, it's scary, but there's nothing that's more in your power than your choices. Just make a good choice. Okay? I'll finish with this. St. Thomas's sister once, he was already a famous theologian, right? And she asked him what she had to do to become a saint. Well, he didn't write a book to answer. He answered her with a single word. And the word was, in Latin, was velle. Just want it. If you really want it, you'll get it with God's help. Okay? But you got to really want it. That's all. Thank you. That's all.